There's been a couple of really important business stories in the past 2 weeks that we should be paying a lot more attention to. One of them was Woolworths and Chuckles. I think most members of the Business News tribe are Chuckles eaters. And the running there has been made by the Financial Mail, and the editor-in-chief of the FM group, Rob Rose, is with us today to talk through that story. And then there's another one with News 24 and ProNutro. Now, I mention that because Rob, in his latest column for the FM, spoke about both, or focused on both of those, and you drew some parallels with Coca-Cola. Was it 41 years ago that our investment guru, Piet Viljoen, said that they made the biggest blups of all when they got rid of Coke, what was it, just Coke Normal, and brought in Cherry Coke and Coke Zero and got rid of the thing that everybody wanted. And I think the point you made, Rob, which I'd love to explore with you today, is that executives sometimes follow what their research tells them rather than what the market is telling them. And I love the point that you said, those brands don't belong to the executives. They actually belong to the consumers, the people who buy them.
Yeah, Alex, thanks so much for having me on the show. I mean, I think that's exactly the point, is that, I referred to Piet Viljoen, who talked about the lessons from New Coke, which is essentially that, they launched this new flavor, like you said, and it lasted all of 79 days before Coke realized this is not going to work. And I have a sense often that South African brands haven't learned that lesson, that there's a degree of arrogance, or I'm not quite sure what it is, a doggedness of sticking to what the marketing people have told them before and not listening to what the market says. And I think that that's what we've seen with ProNutro, which is, it's a fantastic old brand. I think a lot of people had that as kids, and they launched this new brand, and it's been savaged in, the widespread courts of public opinion. And unfortunately, Bacomo, who owns it, who's now owned by PepsiCo, have just said, well, I'm sorry, we can't bring it back. And I'm just not sure that they've internalized the lessons of New Coke, or I suppose so many other consumer brands where they've had these issues.
It's extraordinary, isn't it, that people get these senior positions and now they almost believe that they must make these big decisions, even though sometimes the best thing to do is do nothing.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I also think that, you do make the decision based upon the best knowledge you have at the time and the research you have. And we've seen numerous rebrands of big organizations that, where you think, well, this is a far worse brand that you're rebranding to than the previous one you had that was working fine. And I suppose, it's the extent to which you're then willing to admit that you got it wrong. And I think that that's where a lot of people stumble. I think it's fine to kind of try new things and see if it works. But if it doesn't, then I think have the humility and the acceptance that the market often does know better than you, and bring back what was working.
How did you guys get into this Woolies story? I see that even Jordan Hill-Lewis is now, I guess he just quipped about the fact that this is a national tragedy and the GNU needs to sort it out. But where did it come from, the company that's now in liquidation?
Yeah, I think the dispute was essentially around Bayers, which was this chocolatier that made a lot of, they made sweetie pie besides Chuckles. They made a lot of other chocolates for Woolworths. And quite rightfully, I think they wanted to diversify their earnings away from just Woolworths. So they wanted to kind of supply other brands like Checkers, for example. And Woolworths decided that this isn't the optimal way that they want to do things. They prefer to have a supplier providing just to them. And this seems to be the root behind the kind of fallout between the two, which led to Bayers being placed in liquidation. And Woolworth tried to recalibrate the orders, and I think that lost Bayers essentially about 200 million rand a year, which is a massive amount to absorb as a consumer brand, as a chocolatier. So this led to them being placed in liquidation. Woolworths then said afterwards, well, these brands are going to stay on the shelves. Chuckles is going nowhere thanks to the fact that they obviously see themselves as owners, and that'll placate people like Jordan Hill-Lewis. But I think it also, the bigger story, I think, is how these big brands treat their suppliers. And I think that there's often an imbalance there. And you saw it with Pick and Pay years ago. I mean, they had often quite dysfunctional relationships with many of their suppliers. And you see many retailers realize they have buying power, and it could lead them to try and exploit that and bully the suppliers. And, often these suppliers down the line are just barely making it. If you're a one source chocolatier, there aren't too many places you're going to go. And if you can't diversify your earnings and widen your base, then what are you going to do? So I think it speaks a lot to how corporate power is used in the retail sector.
Both of us have got enough grey hair to remember that when the ANC first came into power, they said we're going to break this oligopoly in South Africa. There are far too many big companies that control too much, and the little guy hasn't had an opportunity to break through. It sounds to me like they haven't made much progress, or indeed there hasn't been too much progress on that front, because if Woolies didn't even have the humanity to be able to say, okay, you can supply something else to someone else, we can demand that you only supply to us. They kind of got you by the shorts, haven't they? And you haven't got much of much freedom if you're in that position.
For sure. I mean, Alec, first off there, I think I have way more grey hair than you do. So that there's definitely a power imbalance there, first off. But secondly, I mean, I think you and I would both also agree that you don't want the government interfering too much in how the private sector does its business. So rather have a situation where you don't have people at the Competition Commission trying to intervene and rebalance things and let the market sort it out to a large extent. So you would imagine that if you behave unethically as a business, you would have your comeuppance to some extent later. And obviously you have big organizations that are then run by different people who then abuse those relationships. But then, I tend to think that naturally recalibrates. And you have the suppliers then trying to migrate to other people in the supply chains. So they haven't had much success in reducing these oligarchies, but to some extent, that's a mercy. I wouldn't want the ANC deciding where we can shop and can't shop. I think that's something that I think will sort itself out in the longer run. And I think that you did see suppliers take a stand against Pick and Pay maybe 15, 20 years ago, or even longer. And in the longer term, you look at Pick and Pay's trajectory, and it's been far more troubled than someone like Checkers. So you could say perhaps there is a market consequence to that. And that's the better option, is that suppliers recalibrate, they supply someone else, and those other players tend to then do better in the market. So yeah, hopefully that's the best way that it plays out in the end.
Woolies, do you think that there will be a similar kind of kickback? Because now suddenly, hey, it might be happening to me and I can't say anything, but it's gone on with this chocolatier and it's now very public. Maybe it's time for us to raise our voices too.
Yeah, absolutely. I think these kind of moments often act as a catalyst for many organizations to say, well, we should also re-examine our supplier relationships. It'd be fascinating to speak to Woolworths and find out exactly what the actual story is in this particular case. But I do think that it's focused a lot of attention on these supplier relationships. And obviously, when you are supplying a company like Woolworths, you don't want to make a public fuss because, to some extent, you're still doing business with them and you don't want to create a bad image for yourself in the market. And so that is one of those dynamics in these kind of relationships that prove how, I suppose, how unbalanced it still is. But Woolworths has had a contested history of various things like this. So we'll see. I mean, we had the news today that Pick and Pay is also now re-examining its employee relationships, and I think there's a lot of water flowing under the retail sector at the moment that is leading to a complete recalibration of the way things work. ShopRite and Checkers has been the powerhouse for the last 20 years. And it's a tough time for consumers, obviously, and people are not spending as much. CPI is pushing up because of fuel. So I think that the retailers are going to face a lot of pressure, and those that behave badly towards the suppliers are going to feel the absolute impact of that, as they should.
Healthcare matters, but what matters most?
Having cover for the people who keep this business going.
Bonitas is there for you when it counts. Bonitas, medical aid for South Africa. Visit bonitas.co.za and find your plan.
Yeah, the wheel always turns. But let's dwell a bit on that ProNutro's story, which came out of News 24. And it is something that it's not the first time that Pepsi Cola have blown it. They did something similar a little bit earlier on, and we can talk about that as well. But the whole ProNutro thing seems to me to be, as an outsider, it looks like total arrogance. Sorry, we've brought in new machinery. We're making new products. We can't make what you wanted. Tough luck. Or am I being a little unfair to them?
Well, no, I mean they said they ran 2 taste tests. Wendy Nola is their consumer journalist, and she's done a great work on this. She asked them about this, and they said, "Well, no, we did a couple of blind taste tests, and it turns out that the first taste test came back quite negative for the new ProNutro. They then claimed there was a second one that actually, people were more generous towards the new brand. But the public comments have been lacerating. I mean, they've said that one person said, even my dog walked away from it. There was a person who said, well, I did feed it to the neighborhood birds and they didn't mind it, so perhaps that's not too bad. But for a consumer brand that was the staple in everyone's house growing up, I think it's having a market advantage and throwing it away. I mean, ProNutro had massive brand value, so to then claim, oh well, we had to redo it, and then not really tell anyone about it and why they were doing it, is poor. And then, like you said, what happened is they said, well, we can't bring back the old brand we had. We have to bring you this new brand because it's something about the factory just couldn't produce it, and it needed to be overhauled, and there was just no way to do it profitably. It would have to add something like 25 rand per box for us to go back to the old formula. But I mean, that's what they say. I think most people are quite skeptical of the explanation. But even if they're not, even if it is largely true what they say, it's they had a massive advantage in one particular segment of the market, and to just throw it away without proper research does speak to a disdain for what consumers want. And I do wonder if it's because PepsiCo is this large foreign organization, and well, consumers will complain, but ultimately they'll still buy the product. I don't think that's true. So I think that's a lesson that they're going to learn from this.
You might recall the Tropicana story as well with Pepsi Cola, where they rebranded in $35 million and nobody bought it. And at least on that one, they did retract.
Yeah, for sure. But, I do feel that this is a case where your initial messaging is terrible too. You haven't told the public what you're doing. You haven't said, you almost try and sneak it into the market by just having new products on the shelves, not saying, well, this is what we're doing and this is why we have to do it. And no one's buying it, or the people who are buying it are then actually taking the further step of going onto online networks and slagging you off. I mean, that's another step entirely. I mean, that's when you've really blown it.
Unilever, Sunlight Green Bar Soap, again, a U-turn on that one. So it isn't universal that the companies just drive themselves into the cemetery. But in this case, in the ProNutro one, it does appear as though they painted themselves into a bit of a corner.
Yeah, for sure. I mean, I do wonder what they do from this. I mean, like you said, Unilever backed down on that. And I think the lesson from New Coke or from Coke is that they recanted, and within 79 days, the old product was back. I think you do massive damage that extends beyond the particular brand. This will extend beyond just ProNutro. Bacomo produces all kinds of things. It produces rusks. If you've been treated badly by a consumer brand, I think the impact of that is often felt a lot wider than that. And if you can't trust your brands that you have in your house, I do think it leads to a change in the way people think about your particular company. So I think the arrogance and I suppose the lack of input or real input and valuable input from consumers leads you to make bad decisions in the end.
Rob, Pioneer Foods, which PepsiCo owns, which owns Bacomo, was a really good performer for Yanni Mouton and his group, PSG, for many, many years. When they were bought by the international group, did they change management? Do you know? Have you had much insight into that?
I don't really know quite what they've done with management. I remember at the time they said they were trying to keep it largely stable and keep the same management. But Alex, it's the same with a company like Massmart. You have the same management for a while. Walmart takes over, and then you have people flying in from the US who take big, bold decisions that the local management aren't really on board with. And over time, you have a diffusion of the foreign ideal, and the extent that isn't necessarily a bad thing. You have to get new ideas from overseas, and you should absolutely be open to learn from these companies. But when it takes the form of, what we know best always, without any idea of what the local market wants, tolerates, or will accept, that's when you have a big problem. And then, you bought a big brand like Pioneer Foods. You don't want to damage the brand more than you should by not taking input. That's the thing.
Such an interesting point you make there, because when Massmart was bought by Walmart, I remember Whitey Basson saying and in numerous occasions, he said it to me, and I think he said it to anybody who would listen, bring it on, we're going to show them. And boy, did he show them. We were all expecting that the great retail giant from America would come and swamp the South African market, but anything but. So I guess local conditions really do need to be taken into account, especially if you happen to be a foreigner who's come in here to this country.
Oh, massively. And I think the fact is that attests to how great a retailer someone like Whitey Basson was. The fact that he was able to calibrate himself for particularly this market and do so well. I mean, Whitey was somebody who knew, if you listen to Christo Visa speak about going into a shop with Whitey, he will say, we knew that this particular thing should be at the front of the shop and it should be at this particular angle and not at the back of the shop. I mean, that sense of the local market isn't something you just buy. You don't just import American ideals and say, well, this is how we do it here and it'll always work. And that actually it shows on both sides, because when ShopRite went into Nigeria and other places, it didn't succeed as well. So you have the local market is quite specific, as all these markets are. You have to have a good sense of it, and certainly, having a sense of humility about understanding the local market is absolutely what you need.
Rob, just to close off with, no names, no pactoral, but there is a Scandinavian CEO of a major, I better not say what sector, but anyway, in a services sector, has come into South Africa, taken over as the CEO, and the feedback we're getting is he's caused incredible ructions there because it's his way or the highway. And he's got this certain idea that he's bringing in, and he is going to drive it through no matter what. What would given your history and given the research that you've done into this field, what would your judgment on his likelihood of success be?
Well, I mean, Alec, I'm sure it's very similar to your assessment of his likely success. I mean, the thing is, a company like that will have been attractive to foreigners because it did so well locally. I think when you have somebody who says it's my way or the highway, the leadership team tends to leave very quickly, and you tend to lose a lot of loyalty amongst staff. I mean, that kind of thing. It's amazing that it works overseas occasionally because it just seems destined for failure. There are people who've said that you need to have a certain degree of bullying, a bullying demeanor for a CEO, but I don't think that works anymore necessarily. You need to have a good sense of what it is, but I think you absolutely need to take your management team along with you on that journey. You have to have people seized by the vision, the common vision you have for that particular company. If there's an absolute division, that's never going to work.
It's so interesting, isn't it? You and I have had this front row seat into the corporate world, and we've watched the movies being played over and over again. And yet those who are in the movies seem to forget that they really could find out just by watching what has happened before.
That's amazing. It's like people don't realize this is actually a sequel. And you're so right. You see it so many times and exactly the same mistakes. But even in the companies I know very well, I mean, people come in with new ideas, and then after a while they believe that this is the first time they're trying it. But it's been tried a million times before, and you just haven't learned these lessons. And perhaps it's just human psychology. You have to make the mistake yourself. But the inability to learn from the past is staggering sometimes.
Rob Rose is the editor-in-chief of the Financial Mail Group, and his column on this Woolworths, Chuckles, ProNutro, Coke is on Biz News today by permission of Rob and his team, and we look forward to featuring him and his colleagues more often on Biz News TV. I'm Alec Hogg from biznews.com.